Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader, and today I'm going to give you my ultimate guide to alternate history books. So in the past few years I have personally read over 40 alternate history books. It might be my favorite genre in fiction, and there's a lot of different topics that are covered in alternate history, although the number of authors within alternate history is a lot smaller than within other genres. And the thing is that most of the known alternate history books are actually written by one person, Harry Turtledove, and about 3/4 of the alternate history books I've read are by Harry Turtledove, so I'm gonna have a separate category for him at the beginning of this video, and then I'm gonna talk about other authors. And in my experience, I'm gonna talk about all of the alternate history books that I've read, and I'm gonna briefly recommend whether you should read or not read them. So my first alternate history was the series Southern Victory by Harry Turtledove, which is a really big series made up of 11 volumes. So first you have the first volume, which is How Few Remain, and then you have the Great War trilogy, and then you have the American Empire trilogy, and finally you have the Settling Accounts tetralogy. So this is an 11 volume series, and these are large books, about 600 pages each, and they are about what if the South won the American Civil War and then becoming independent, and then you see the evolution of the American South and the American North as separate republics from the 1860s, although the story begins in practice in the 1880s, up to the end of the Second World War, so in the 1940s. So the first volume takes place in the early 1880s, and then the following volumes start at World War I with the Great War trilogy in 1914. It moves up to the interwar period with the American Empire trilogy, which is up to 1941 here. So World War II starts a little later and is a little shorter in this series. And this series in Settling Accounts ends around 1946, a bit after World War II. So this is a large spanning series of, what, about 6,600 pages or so, covering a very large timeline of half a century to a century of world history in an alternate sense. And it's very interesting, although it becomes a bit more implausible over time, but it's very well written. The characters are really good, so you get a wide spectrum of people, and you get people who evolve from being good guys to bad guys, and you get people across varying professions, so you get women, soldiers, sailors, important officers, politicians, socialists, aristocrats, workers. It's a nice mix, and I love this alternate book series. It was actually the first alternate history that I read, and it's what got me into the genre. And for me, it's Harry Turtledove's magnum opus. Another series you could read that's not as good but still quite good is the World War series, which is in 3 parts. So first you have 4 volumes, World War, which covers World War II, and this is basically a series where aliens come to Earth in the middle of World War II, around the time that Reinhard Heydrich, I think, was killed or so. Now humans have to unite against aliens. So now Nazis, Soviets, Americans, Brits, and the Japanese are all on the same side against the aliens. But the series does not end with World War II, but actually moves on to the 60s. With the colonization trilogy, where you have an uneasy peace between the aliens and humans. The aliens are controlling a large part of the earth, and you see the dynamics with the remaining great powers around the world. You have to coexist with them. And this series ends with Homeward Bound, which takes place far later. So I think in the 21st or 22nd century. Here you have the humans visiting the homeworld of the aliens. And it's a very interesting series. So the weird thing with these aliens is that although it's an authoritarian empire, it's a lot less harsh regime than what the Soviets or the Japanese or the Nazis have. And it's quite interesting sci-fi, where you get to see the aliens get hooked on drugs, and also they get horny from drugs. So it's a really weird series at times, but you get a wide cast of characters again, and Harry Turtledove books usually focus mainly on the United States, but here you get characters across the world. So Japanese, Americans, Soviets, Germans, and also a bunch of aliens, which are interesting. So if you want a strong sci-fi bent of alternate history, then you should definitely check out the World War series. And it's a bit shorter than Southern Victory. Only 8 volumes. If you want to read something much shorter, like a trilogy, then you should read the Atlantis trilogy. And these books are shorter, about 400 or 500 pages. And in this timeline, you have an alternate history where the American East Coast is its own continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And you see this part, Atlantis, develop independently from Terra Nova or the New World. It's basically a parallel timeline of American history, apart from the third book. So the first book, you get to see the colonizers of America, or Atlantis, and it also includes pirates and the 7 Years' War. The second book is basically the American Revolution and War of Independence. And the third book is a slave revolt instead of an American Civil War. And you also get to follow a dynasty within this book trilogy, the Radcliffe dynasty. As interestingly, pretty much all of the important characters in this book are Radcliffes. And they dominate politics and the military and even the slave revolt, interestingly. I'm gonna disagree with Alternate History Hub, so he made a video where he basically trashes this trilogy because he just views it as American History 101. And sure, the history timeline is not super original, but there are still some changes which he glosses over, like liberating Atlantis. The slave revolt is quite different from the American Civil War. It's still interesting to learn about parallel American history. And there are still some changes, like you have consuls instead of presidents, and you also have some weird animals here in Atlantis that are hunted to extinction through the colonizers. A slightly less good but still good trilogy you can check out is the Hot War trilogy. And this is a trilogy where the Korean War goes from being a Cold War to a Hot War, which means that it expands to 1, a World War, and 2, you have nukes that are used. But since this is 1950, nukes are not that powerful yet, so while you do have a bunch of destruction and death through nuclear exchange, you still have another world war going on. And yet again, you get the perspective of several characters in this book, several different Jews. You get the perspective of the American president, Harry Truman, some Soviet soldiers. It's an interesting trilogy. Makes you maybe a bit happy that we didn't have a nuclear war and that the Cold War stayed cold. And this is an even shorter trilogy, so the books here are a bit under 400 pages. For Harry Turtledove series, it's a relatively quick read. So that's the series that I read by Harry Turtledove that I would recommend. Now let's move on to some standalones if you want to just read one book by Harry Turtledove instead of getting enmeshed in a series. So Harry Turtledove, in my opinion, has actually written several good standalone alternate history books. So let's start with a couple of the more well-known ones. So first of all, you have, of course, the Guns of the South book, which is a book where you have Afrikaners, apartheiders, going back in time with a time machine and giving the Southerners, Confederates, Kalashnikovs to win the Civil War. Is this a plausible book at all? No. But it's still interesting and fun. And you actually see different degrees of racism in this book. So you understand that the Confederates overall, their racism is far less sinister and far less cruel than the racism of many apartheiders from South Africa. And not all of this book is actually about the American Civil War. A large part of it is the following years where the American South is independent and the tensions you have with the Afrikaners within this country, and also the feeling, yeah, we should maybe abolish slavery actually. And Robert E. Lee is actually presented quite as a nuanced character who he's a leader of the South kind of, but he doesn't really like slavery himself. So it's an interesting dilemma you are presented with in this book. Next book is Joe Steele. And again, not really a plausible book. Joseph Stalin is born in the United States instead of in Soviet Russia. He rises to power to become an American president and pretty much an American dictator. You have Leon Trotsky instead in the Soviet Union. And you have the United States slowly turned into a police state, kind of a banana republic by the end of the book. And it's actually a funny, entertaining read, but a bit dark also with the concentration camps that are set up in this book for people who are dissidents of the regime of Joe Steele. And this book has the perspective of two brothers who are journalists, one who decides to back Joe Steele and one who decides to be a dissident. And the thing is, short-term one benefits, short-term one is hurt, but the ending of the book kind of has some poetic justice relating to people who side with dictators within their own country. So definitely an interesting take of the United States turning into a dictatorship, although not really plausible. Another book you should check out is Through Darkest Europe. which is a short alternate history book actually. It's slightly over 300 pages. And here Harry Turtledove swaps something important that happened in history. So one of the reasons that the West is free and open and rich is that a lot of our ideas are based on Thomas Aquinas, which is one of the originators of liberal theory and progress in science. While Al-Ghazali in the Middle East was extremely conservative, wanted to focus completely on the Quran and was very anti-science, which is why the Middle East stagnated for longer than Europe. But here, this book reverses this scenario where you have the Middle East that's prosperous and free and liberal democratic, while you have Europe that's a backwater with a bunch of terrorism and war. And you actually have Christian jihadists in this book. So it's an entertaining read. It has a few flaws like Joe Steele, but I still enjoyed reading it. You get the perspective of a couple of Arabs in this book, one of which is Jewish, who are trying to stop this terrorism wave that you have in Italy, where you have some Grand Duke that's ruling. So an interesting parallel history of problems in the Middle East today, but transplanted to Europe in this book. Another book you should check out, that's alternate history, but very different alternate history from the other books on this list, is Alpha and Omega. And this is basically a alternate history book of what if the end of days actually happened? What if God returns like in the New Testament? I don't know much about this, but it's a very interesting novel. In large part it takes place in Israel, and you have a bunch of revelations, and you have some interesting character perspectives. So you both have the Christian perspective through a televangelist, you have the Jewish perspective through some archaeologists, but also through religious Jews, and you also have the Muslim perspective through Palestinians. And Turtledove kind of brings a unity to these three religions in the end of days in this book. So it's an interesting, odd book. It's hard to describe, it's just odd. And you also get the perspective kind of the political dynamics in Israel nowadays through this book. Remember, this book was just written a few years ago. The final Turtledove book I'm gonna recommend here is In the Presence of My Enemies, which is actually one of Harry Turtledove's best novels. And it's his take on the Nazis winning World War II. And it's not at all plausible, because here the Nazis basically conquer a large part of the world and leave a couple of spheres of influences for Japan and a few allies and Italy. But the Nazis have taken over America. They have a large empire that goes into Siberia and America, and it's an interesting novel. You get the perspective of a closeted Jew. So he's a German bureaucrat, but he's actually secretly a Jew with a Jewish family. And you get to see the fear of living in a totalitarian state that will stop at nothing to exterminate the remaining Jews. But it's also kind of an analogy to the end of the Soviet Union with glasnost and perestroika. It shows you how totalitarianism and authoritarian decadent states fall apart. So it's an interesting book that shows how totalitarian or decadent authoritarian empires start falling apart eventually. So this book takes place around 2010. You have a reform-minded Führer who comes to power and starts changing stuff, and you get to see the dynamics with the army and the SS. And you get your own revolution and failed coup and all that. So definitely an entertaining and interesting read. Now let's move on to books or series you should not read by Harry Turtledove. I don't have many listed here. So first of all, you have the Days of Infamy duology. So I read the first book, but not the second one. The first one I find quite boring. So here you have the Japanese, after Pearl Harbor, launching a full invasion of Hawaii. And you get to see them taking over the place. And there's some interesting elements in this book, but a lot of it's boring. And there's, for example, a guy who just goes surfing around in this book in Hawaii. Yeah, it's a bit repetitive from earlier Harry Turtledove books with different soldiers that are quite forgetful. I mean, there are two Japanese officers here that I mix up. I don't know who's talking to who, what each character did. So this book's characters is quite forgetful. I know that people like to complain that Harry Turtledove characters are crap. I don't agree usually, but here they actually kind of suck. So I did not even bother to read the sequel and of the beginning, even though I have it, because this book is 500 pages, but it took me a while to read, a lot longer than other volumes in Harry Turtledove's series. So I would not recommend this series by Harry Turtledove. And then there are a couple of Harry Turtledove standalones that I would recommend not to read either. So most controversially, I would probably include Rule Britannia. And this is an alternate history where the Spanish won against the British in the late 16th century. So basically the Spanish conquered Britain, and they're ruling now. And you have Shakespeare in this book who's writing a play to start a British revolt to liberate Queen Elizabeth I. And there's a bunch of theatre in this book. And I don't really like theatre, and it uses the theatre language of Tao, because this is Shakespeare from 500 years ago, so English is quite different at that time than from now. So I found it just irritating to read, because I like modern English. I don't like extremely archaic English. Reading English from 200, 300 years ago, that's fine. But reading English that has to do with Shakespeare in its old form is a bit painful. I mean, the ending was good in this book, but apart from that, it was a boring read for me. And I don't even know really what's happening sometimes with different theatre characters in this book. So maybe people who really like Shakespeare would like this book, but I certainly do not. The next Harry Turtledove book I'm gonna recommend you to skip is actually his most recent release, I believe. So this is 3 Miles Down, and it's a short book. It's only about 250 pages. And despite being a short book, it's a painfully slow read for me. This is a novel of the first contact, so a novel that's supposed to be where aliens and humans meet. And it takes place during the Nixon era in the 1970s. And the Nixon era stuff with Watergate is kind of interesting. But the thing with First Contact is that it doesn't really happen in this book. It's a letdown. The First Contact really happens towards exactly at the end of the book, like the last sentence or so. So this book is very underwhelming and fails to deliver on its promise of humans and aliens meeting. And the writing at times is just boring, of describing just a Californian scientist hanging in a submarine or whatever. Although it does have some decent Harry Turtledove humor, which I appreciate. But overall I would recommend you to skip 3 Miles Down. So now I'm done with talking about Harry Turtledove specifically. I'm gonna move on to some other authors, and I have far less books to talk about, and these are pretty much all standalones. So first book I would recommend is Lest Darkness Fall by El Sprague de Caen. And this is actually the book that inspired Harry Turtledove. So it's a pioneer in alternate history, and it's quite short, about a couple hundred pages or so, I think. And it's a book about preventing the Dark Ages. So a guy goes back in time to the era a bit after the Roman Empire has collapsed. So I think it takes place in the 6th or 7th century with the time of Justinian. And you have the Ostrogoths here in Italy, where the character goes to. And the guy is basically promoting technological progress and handling royal aristocratic dynamics in fighting, and trying to prevent Europe falling into a millennia of darkness, as happened in our historical timeline, kind of. And it's actually a really well written book. It might be my favorite alternate history book, so I would strongly recommend it. Especially if you're interested in thinking about how could we actually have prevented the Dark Ages. By the way, the Middle Ages sucked and were worse than the Roman Republic, whatever medieval historians like to pretend. Next alternate history book I would recommend you is Fatherland by Robert Harris. This is also a known alternate history book. So here you have the Nazis winning World War II, but it's a relatively plausible scenario, and you have a Cold War between the Germans and the Americans, and then you have the Soviets kind of still fighting, although Germany has taken over part of the Soviet Union. And it's a story of a German SS agent uncovering some really screwed up stuff. So it's a good thriller with an amazing ending. One of the best takes on the Nazis winning World War II. Another slightly less good, but still worth reading, Nazis winning World War II scenario is Dominion by C.J. Sansom. And here the scenario is extremely plausible and really well developed, and it has a nice map here of basically you have here the Brits making peace with the Germans in 1940, because you have Lord Halifax who comes to power as Prime Minister instead of Churchill, and you have Britain slowly descending into an authoritarian Nazi-aligned state. And you see things gradually getting worse for the Jews. And it's a thrilling read. It also has a nice bullying backstory. It has a couple of issues, but overall it's a very well-developed piece of alternate history. When I think about it, it's probably the best developed scenario and the most plausible scenario I've read of the Nazis winning World War II. If you also like thrillers like Fatherland, you should also probably like Dominion. And it takes place, by the way, in Britain with civil servants and Gestapo agents. Next book I would recommend is actually Alternate History Hub's own book, so by Cody Franklin, the Atlantropa articles. So this is an alternate history book taking place long into the future, where the Nazis won peacefully, not by war. So you had this project where the Mediterranean was actually drained And you basically get to follow the story of a sand crew on some ship who are passing through the Mediterranean, which is actually entirely now made of sand instead of having water in it. And it's a interesting, very different book from typical alternate history books. And I would hope that Alternate History Hub would write another alternate history book eventually. The final book I'm gonna recommend, which I'm a bit hesitant to recommend, is actually 11/22/63 by Stephen King. So Stephen King is a great author. And 11/22/63 has a really good story. So you have a guy who travels back in time to stop the Kennedy assassination. So the scenario itself of how the Kennedy assassination is stopped is amazing. And this book also shows that Kennedy was not murdered in some extremely sinister way. It was just Lee Harvey Oswald, who was a crazy guy who whacked Kennedy. The alternate history you get in this book, which is about the last 100 pages of this over 700-page book or so, I think, the alternate history just goes crazy. It's not plausible at all. However, since this is Stephen King, there's some big fantastical element with the world screwing up if you try to interfere with historical processes. So it's still a worthwhile read, I would say, although it's extremely implausible for alternate history. Like you have, for example, nukes being dropped on Vietnam in this book, and George Wallace becoming president eventually. And you have, I think, Maine becoming a wasteland. So yeah, it's a good story. It's not necessarily good alternate history, but hey, you might still want to check this book out. Especially if you want to see what Stephen King can actually do with his take on alternate history. And now I'm gonna move on to the novels by other authors that you should certainly skip. And unfortunately, a much larger proportion of books by other authors than Harry Turtledove, that's alternate history, are bad. Or at least mediocre. So I'm gonna start with a couple of books that are meh. So you could maybe read them, but I don't really think it's worth it. So there's The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. So for some reason people really like this book, often by Philip K. Dick. And he's a really weird and interesting author, Philip K. Dick. However, I did not like this book that much. There's a lot of interesting elements. So the Nazis winning World War II. They conquered the eastern third of America. The Japanese conquered the western third, and the middle third in between is independent. And you do have a lot of interesting elements in this book, and you have some interesting action towards the end, but then the very ending of this book is just confusing, and then I had to go on Wikipedia to actually understand what it meant. So the ending of this book is not at all well written. It's very lackluster with who the man in the high castle is himself. He's just a guy who basically, oh, stuff's happening, I don't really care, who cares? So it feels a bit hollow, this book, when you take into account the ending. So it has interesting elements, so maybe you should read it, but there are a lot of other much better takes on the Nazis winning World War II than The Man in the High Castle. Next book that I think you should probably skip is The Second Sleep by Robert Harris. So this is basically the weirdest book by Robert Harris, the one that's not really political fiction or historical fiction, but alternate history unto itself. And I'm not gonna spoil it because it's a very weird timeline, but the very beginning of this book is boring. The ending is alright, but you basically follow a priest who comes to a village where a previous priest dies, and he investigates, and he also wakes up in the middle of the night sometimes, and then he goes and visits some women, and there's some weird love triangle in this book, and it's maybe sounds interesting to you, but it's a lot less interesting on paper than as an idea. So the plot twist, sure, it's interesting, but the book overall is not that well executed. And then we're moving on to the books that, without a doubt, I'm recommending you skip them. Just skip them. So first of all, you have The Sky People by S.M. Stirling. So S.M. Stirling is actually the next biggest alternate history author, probably. And in this book, you have a Cold War that's actually been exported now to Venus or Mercury. You have the Soviets and the Americans there, and you have weird dinosaurs and Neanderthals and humans living there. But it's really bad alternate history. It's really badly written. It's boring to read. So dinosaurs should be fun to read about. It's not really in this book. There's a couple of interesting elements, but overall I didn't like it. And then the ending just goes full on fantasy. It stops being alternate history, because alternate history fundamentally is a certain type of sci-fi. It needs to be plausible. This book is not plausible at all towards the end. There's some weird magical stuff. And there's a sequel to this book, I know, of The Sky People, but I'm not gonna read it because I didn't enjoy reading this book. But it was a bit better than the next two books I'm gonna mention. So first of all, you have The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. Philip Roth, a Pulitzer Prize winner somehow. This is basically a hate letter written against Republicans. You have Charles Lindbergh winning the 1940 election instead of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, basically saying, okay, we're gonna be neutral in World War II, we're gonna institute conscription, and we're gonna have an understanding with Hitler. And you have America apparently slowly turning into a Nazi fascist state with more and more anti-Semitism. But the thing is, most of what happens isn't that sinister. So yeah, there's some weird stuff that's done against the Jews, but they're not really persecuted per se that much, except towards really at the end of this book. So this book takes place from 1940 to 1942, and it's an extremely pro-democratic party, clearly, this book. It loves Wilson for some reason. And the Jews are so-called being assimilated into society in this book, and then towards the end stuff goes crazy, and there's someone trying to turn America into an anti-Semitic dictatorship. So the build-up sucks in this book. Also, this is a Jewish family in this book that you follow as characters, but it's just weird. Like, you have Jewish kids stalking regular Americans, which what the hell am I reading? The penultimate chapter of this book ends the story basically in a synopsis way, which is kind of interesting, but then you have an additional chapter which just retells the story, the ending, in a more boring way, and you have these kids who know each other, and it's just boring. And it's a caricature just of the American right and of isolationism. Just because something's not good does not mean it's totalitarian or fascist or Nazi or whatever. But it was still slightly better than the Yiddish Policemen's Union, which at times you don't even know what they're talking about. Like, this is a scenario where you have the Jews failed establishing Israel as an independent state. The Holocaust happened to a smaller scale, I think, and the Jews basically got a lease on a part of Alaska to settle there, and now that lease is gonna expire and you have some conspiracy thing. There's a Yiddish police officer whose story you follow, and it just sucks. There are times you don't even know what they're really talking about, and the ending and whatever. Just overall the book sucks. It's bad. Like, I don't have anything good really to say about this book. It's a detective story, but it's a far worse written one than Fatherland. In my opinion, avoid this book, The Yiddish Policemen's Union by Michael Chabon, like the plague. And also, this is a Pulitzer-winning author. What's up with Pulitzer-winning authors writing bad alternate history books? I read a bunch of bad alternate history books this year, which kind of have put me in a reading slump with alternate history. So yeah, I know there's a lot more alternate history books to read, but I think knowing which of the 45 books or so that I mentioned you should read and which one you should avoid is a pretty good start for the beginner reader who wants to read alternate history. As you can tell, you can see that I'm a big Turtledove fan, less so of other alternate history authors. I might make another ultimate guide for another genre eventually on this YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about alternate history books, then you can check out this playlist where I've reviewed about 30 alternate history books or so here. Most of the books I've actually mentioned here that I've reviewed on this channel. But otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.